The pot roast was in the oven. The table was set with matching napkins and polished silverware, and soft instrumental music drifted through the house. Elena moved like clockwork, each step practiced, each smile rehearsed. Nathan liked things this way. He liked his home like a magazine spread, quiet, tidy, curated. She caught her reflection in the hallway mirror as she adjusted the candlesticks. The makeup held up well. Just a hint of shadow on her left cheek if someone really looked. But no one really looked. Not closely. Nathan's car pulled into the driveway. Her heart did its now familiar stutter. She smoothed her blouse, checked the roast once more, then stood by the door to greet him with a peck on the cheek and a glass of his favorite whiskey. Everything just the way he liked it. Dinner passed in pleasant conversation, at least the kind where Elena responded with nods and short comments meant to keep the peace. Nathan talked about work, his colleagues, a new senior position opening up in another division. Elena asked a few questions, careful ones. He smiled at her, that polished public smile he wore like a uniform. It wasn't until later, after dishes were cleared and he'd gone to his home office, that the ache in her jaw returned, the place where he'd grabbed her 2 nights earlier, yanking her face toward him for speaking, out of turn. Elena quietly climbed the stairs, past their bedroom, and entered the guest bathroom. She flipped the light on and stared into the mirror. For a moment, she didn't recognize herself, the woman with precise eyeliner, perfect posture, and 1,000 cracks beneath the surface. Was this what being perfect cost? The mirror didn't lie. No filter, no angle could blur the exhaustion behind her eyes, or the way she touched her face as if afraid to feel it. The bruise hadn't faded, not really. From downstairs, she heard Nathan laughing at something on TV. And beneath that, beneath the still soft music and hum of the dishwasher, she realized the silence of someone living far from herself. She pressed a hand to the cold marble sink. No one was coming to rescue her. But maybe she didn't need rescue. Maybe she needed resolve. Elena stood in the soft morning light of her kitchen, spooning honey into a teacup as the kettle began to whistle. The window above the sink offered a peaceful view of manicured lawns and blooming hydrangeas, but she barely saw it. Her thoughts were trapped, looping the moment from 2 nights ago, how fast it had happened, how his hand had risen, and her face had stung before her mind could catch up. She hadn't wanted to believe it, not Nathan. They were supposed to be partners, built from 10 years of shared history, whispered dreams before sleep, house projects done hand in hand. But when she'd shared her excitement about launching her Etsy shop, he'd snapped, accusing her of being distracted, ungrateful. The argument had spiraled. And then his hand landed on her cheek with unexpected force. Cold shock had settled in her bones before panic took over. Now, the bruise on her cheek, a mix of old violet and fading yellow, peeked out despite her careful makeup. She dabbed more concealer as she heard the knock on the front door. Her parents. Her mother floated in, perfectly coiffed, bringing the scent of her signature rose perfume. Her father, Judge Hartley, straight-backed and solemn as always, scanned the house like a man who expected perfection and was ready to note anything less. They sat in the sunlight-drenched formal living room. Her mother complimented the rug. Her father remarked on Nathan's promotion again, sipping the tea she'd prepared. But it happened in a heartbeat. Her father's gaze flicked toward her face, pausing. Her mother followed, her lips parting slightly at the discoloration. The room shifted. Time slowed. But no one said anything. No gasp, no question. Just a brief glance, quickly buried. Her mother reached for a cookie. Her father cleared his throat and asked if Nathan still played tennis on Saturdays. Elena's heart thundered in her chest. She'd braced herself for concern, perhaps even disbelief. But this quiet abandonment, cut deeper. There it was again. Silence. The kind that didn't mend anything, but instead coiled like a vine around truth. As the conversation drifted to vacation plans and the summer club dinner, Elena sat still, blinking. The bruise had been invisible to them not because it wasn't there, but because they refused to see Tahiti china clink softly as Elena's mother placed the steaming teapot on the mahogany table. It was an old family piece, ornate, with gold filigree around the rim, something passed down from her grandmother. Like the family values, Elena thought grimly, polished on the outside and cracked underneath. Nathan smiled cordially, gesturing to the seats at the end of the dining room. Please sit. Elena's made lemon scones, her best yet. Judge Michael Hartley nodded approvingly. Sounds excellent, he said, folding his napkin with practiced precision. His handshake with Nathan had been firm. Too firm. Elena had always noticed how her father's hand lingered just a second longer on the men he respected. Today, it was as if nothing was amiss. As if he hadn't glanced, just briefly, at the subtle discoloration on her cheek. Her mother's gaze had caught it too, hovering for the faintest heartbeat. Not a word fell from her lips, just a polite smile. Are these lavender honey? She asked, biting delicately into a spoon. Elena felt the walls shift inward. She stirred her tea, the spoon tapping softly against ceramic. Her hands trembled ever so slightly, but she kept her gaze down. Not from shame, but disbelief. Her parents always preached values, responsibility, strength, righteousness. But in that bright kitchen where the sunlight spilled politely across white walls and flowered curtains, they chose silence. Not ignorance, conscious choice. Nathan chatted uneasily about his new promotion, how the firm had finally recognized what matters, initiative, leadership. Judge Hartley nodded, murmuring agreement. Elena's mother even laughed once, an airy little sound, like nothing was wrong at all. The Brews spoke, and they replied with tea. As Nathan and her father discussed interest rates and local elections, Elena looked out the window. A small bird flitted to the feeder she had hung just 2 days before. It pecked eagerly, wings flicking in the breeze. Freedom in feathers. When the visit ended, her mother embraced her briefly, careful not to press too close. We're proud of you both, she said. Proud. Elena closed the door behind them with care. She stood in the hallway, letting the silence settle, thick and knowing. Her cheek still throbbed faintly. But the deeper ache came from realizing truth. When given the chance to stand for their daughter, her parents had turned away. And something inside her began to burn. Elena sat on the cold edge of the bathtub, the steam from her rushed morning shower still clinging to the mirror. Her fingertips ghosted over the lavender-colored mark blooming across her cheekbone. The foundation she'd carefully applied had broken down in little patches, leaving behind the truth she hadn't intended her parents to see. She had frozen when they walked in. Her father's eyes had lingered just a second too long. Her mother had stiffened, then offered an oddly cheery smile before disappearing into the kitchen to make tea. Conversations resumed, forced, humming with denial. Nathan, dressed in cufflinks and smiles, leaned back with affected charm, detailing plans for expansion at his firm. No one said a word. But it was the smirk. That tiny, barely there lift on the corner of his lips when Elena's father turned to ask about interest rates after seeing the Brews. That was it. That smirk wasn't just arrogance, it was certainty. Certainty that nothing would happen, that everyone had chosen him over her, that her silence was promised, that their silence was guaranteed. He wore it like armor. Elena leaned in closer to the mirror, heart pounding. The bathroom light flickered above, the silence pressing in like hunger. That bruise was no longer just a mark, it was a message. One everyone saw and chose to ignore. Even the people who had promised to love her unconditionally. I'm not his victim, she whispered, voice trembling but sharp. Not anymore. A spark flared in her chest. Not rage. Something older and steadier. Resolve. Moving with new purpose, she rummaged in the under-sink cabinet, pulling out her old phone. The one Nathan had assumed she'd thrown away. She powered it up a shaky charge, but enough. She took a photo, timestamp activated, bare and unfiltered. Her hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the weight of beginning. She didn't know exactly where this journey would go, but something had started. While the world sipped tea and ignored the obvious, Elena was preparing for something else entirely. Nathan thought he'd won, with that smirk. But he'd only succeeded in awakening someone who no longer cared about pretending, and who was finally ready to fight back. The door clicked softly behind her. Elena turned the lock, her fingers trembling just enough to make it obvious to her, if no one else, that she was holding herself together by threads. The light in the bathroom flickered on, humming quietly, revealing porcelain white tiles and a vanity mirror that had seen her through mascara smudges and party day curls. She stepped onto the cold tile, barefoot, her breath barely audible over the quiet in her ribs. The quiet of trying not to cry, of knowing if she did, it would all come tumbling out. The bruise on her cheek had faded to a sickly purple-yellow blend. An artist might study the hues in fascination, but under the artificial light, it looked like a betrayal, all colors bruises shouldn't be. Elena leaned forward, tracing the delicate edge with 2 fingertips. The skin ached beneath her touch, but what hurt more was what echoed beneath it. How her mother had pretended not to see. How her father, always so decisive in court, had simply redirected the conversation to Nathan's golf handicap as if her pain weren't sitting at their kitchen table. She gripped the edge of the sink and lowered her eyes. She might have asked herself what she had done wrong once, but not anymore. She whispered the words aloud this time, gently like a secret blooming. "You're not his victim." The words surprised her, not because she said them, but because they suddenly rang with truth. It wasn't just a mantra. It was a decision. She straightened her posture, jaw set. There was still fear. But beside it, something else had arrived, quiet and sharp and awakening like morning frost across glass. Nathan had counted on her silence. Her parents had relied on her complicity. But she had a voice, steady, soft, but never hollow. And it was ready to be heard. In the mirror, her eyes, once glassy with shame, now held something different. Something resolute. She reached for her phone from the back pocket of her jeans. In the bottom drawer beneath the cotton pads and folded towels, she had hidden the cheap digital camera she used to photograph her jewelry pieces. Carefully, methodically, she began. First photo, then another. Every scar would become a step forward. Every image, a page in her rising voice. It began here, with whispers. Facing the mirror. Deciding that Elena moved like someone learning to breathe again. After the confrontation with her parents and Nathan's smugness that evening, she knew things had shifted. A line had been crossed, not just by him, but by the people who had always claimed to protect her. That betrayal carved something raw and determined inside her. She needed a plan, not to run, but to rise. Quietly, thoroughly, untraceably. She started small. Upstairs in the guest closet, hidden behind 2 suitcases and an old box of Christ lights, Elena assembled her first safe space. An old showbox wrapped in tissue paper now held a USB drive. Every afternoon when Nathan went for his power jog, she'd lock the door to the study under the ruse of bookkeeping for her Etsy account. In truth, she was building her evidence bank, timestamps, audio recordings, screenshots of text messages laced with veiled threats. She documented everything. The bruise from the slap, captured with that day's newspaper held beside it. The furious voicemail he left when she stayed at the store 10 minutes longer than expected. She didn't cry while recording. She could cry later. This was about collection now. Quiet, unemotional, methodical. Next came backup. She bought a secondhand laptop online, paid in cash, and had it shipped to a P.O. box she had quietly rented months ago under her maiden name in what now felt like a premonition. This laptop, air-gapped and encrypted, became the nucleus of her escape. She reached out, too, carefully, an email to Laura, her college friend, typed slowly, paused often. Subject line, help. Privately. Laura replied within hours. A call followed, on speaker in a rental car parked far from home. Laura's voice was firm, nurturing but clear-headed. She offered strategy, caution, a detailed list of next steps. She didn't blink when Elena told her everything. Elena also started talking to people Nathan dismissed, Sandra, the housekeeper he corrected harshly. Alan, a junior analyst he snapped at during dinner parties. Allies, if she moved carefully. By week 2, Elena had a calendar mapped out. She would file the restraining order on a Monday, drop the blog post that Friday. Laura would time the lawsuit the following week. And when it all went public, it would be all at once, not a single ember, but a controlled wildfire burning through lies. The silence that evening was loud. Elena sat alone in her bedroom, the dim lamplight casting shadows on the walls. In the mirror, the fading yellow edges of the bruise on her cheek glared back at her, like a watermark that refused to disappear. Her fingers lingered over the soft swell, hesitating. She could still feel the echo of his hand. But worse than the pain, worse than the insult, was what had followed. She hadn't cried when Nathan raised his voice. She hadn't cried when he hit her. But when her parents looked at that mark and said nothing, her tears had come in silence, building slowly until her pillow was damp. Nathan had been cheerful after they left, even affectionate, offering to order takeout and asking what she wanted to watch on TV. That familiar charm, the switch he flipped so easily, made her stomach knot. It wasn't just him anymore. It was them too. They saw. They knew. And they chose to pretend. Elena moved to the bathroom. The door latched with a soft click behind her. She stood in front of the mirror once more, forcing herself to hold her own gaze. The bruise had changed, yes, but beneath it, something else changed, too. The hurt stripped something inside her down to its rawest form, not weakness, but clarity. "You're not his victim," she whispered. The words weren't loud, but in the quiet of the tiled room, they echoed like thunder. That night, she began. She retrieved the old Canon camera from the attic, took photos in different lighting, holding up that day's newspaper for the date. She slid her phone under the hallway vent and left voice memos as if chatting to herself. Names, dates, insults, every incident carefully marked, cataloged, recorded. In bed, while Nathan slept facing away, she stared at the ceiling and planned. The storm had already started inside her. She could feel it gathering power like a distant thundercloud rising from a once clear sky. She had never raised her voice. She had never fought fire with fire. But now she didn't need to shout. Justice would be louder than any scream that Elena learned early that silence, when wielded with intention, could become its own kind of armor. In the weeks that followed her moment in the mirror, that hollow, swollen-cheeked reflection whispering rebellion, Elena moved carefully through her days. She smiled at neighbors, passed out freshly baked muffins at home meetings, kissed Nathan goodbye before he left for work. But behind those calm eyes, something far more precise and methodical was unfolding. She waited until Nathan's nightly Scotch ritual began. By the second drink, he'd retreat to his study, and by the third, he was loud but immobile. That's when she would move. The old laptop she'd purchased, paid for with her first few Clayring sales, was hidden inside the hollow lining of a showbox in their bedroom closet. She named the file folder recipes, but when opened, it was anything but apple pie and lasagna. Inside were time-stamped photos. Her cheek, the bruise on her arm after he'd grabbed her too hard, the shattered teacup she was punished for spilling. Carefully, quietly, she filmed voice memos recounting incidents. The stressed audio logs with his voice, not shouting, no, but the deliberate cadence of someone who knew he could break things and no one would stop him. When Nathan shouted at Sandra, the housekeeper, Elena installed a hidden camera in the hallway vent under the guise of improving air quality. It caught more than she expected. His voice, a whispery condescension laced with threats, captured in pixels and preserved in the cloud. Alan, the junior staffer from Nathan's firm, responded to her tentative email with a surprising eagerness. "I've seen the way he treats people. Whatever you need, I'm in." Every evening after Nathan dozed, she'd plug in the device, transferring voice files, images, short notes. She labeled everything meticulously. It wasn't just about building a case. It was about reclaiming truth. Elena wasn't gathering shadows to live in them. She was collecting light, fragments of proof, pixel by pixel, word by word, until the weight of her quiet truth became something undeniable. And one day soon, it would rise. Morning, the blog post went viral. Elena sat in her small makeshift studio, sunlight glancing off trays of half-finished silver pendants. The radio was on low, a string of cello music humming in the background. She hadn't expected it to spread like wildfire. In truth, she'd thought maybe a few other women might read it, nod in grim solidarity, and move on. She'd published it anonymously with cautious hope, half resigned to it fading into the digital void. But the comments flooded in by noon, thousands of shares. Then screenshots on Twitter. Someone recognized the kitchen backsplash in one of the photos, his backsplash, and from there, the internet did its thing. Names surfaced. So did news outlets. Elena read with quiet dread as hashtags formed as her story became a headline. She hadn't even told Laura yet. By sunset, a voicemail buzzed in from a producer at a national morning show. Someone wanted her on camera. She didn't respond. Instead, she opened her laptop and quietly refreshed the advocacy site's homepage. Her story was now #1. Her inbox overflowed with letters from strangers, women, men, even teenagers, writing about secrets they'd never had the voice to say aloud. It brought her to tears, not from anxiety, but from unexpected solidarity. People weren't just watching, they were listening. 3 days later, the media began camping outside Nathan's office. The firm scrambled to distance themselves. Pending investigation, they said. Elena watched it unfold while sipping coffee she had brewed herself, calm but alert. The name Elena Hartley eventually leaked, of course. It was inevitable. But when it did, something remarkable happened. Instead of backlash, the tide turned harder in her favor. Her Etsy orders tripled. Emails came in from women's shelters asking for a partnership. Laura called, half in disbelief. "Do you know what you just started?" Elena did know. For the first time in years, her voice had echoed beyond her own four walls. Her silence had become power. The fear she'd worn like armor now fell away, piece by piece. For the first time since it began, she walked outside, not as Nathan's wife, not as her parents' daughter, but as herself. And the world finally saw Her. Nathan Whitmore always walk like the world owed him respect. Crisp suits, custom tailored. That ever-present smirk suggesting he'd won some game no one else knew he was playing. For a decade, Elena had watched him charm neighbors, impress colleagues, and expertly play the role of the ideal husband. People adored him. He was Mr. Perfect to all who met him. But perfection, Elena learned, was a costume. 3 weeks after their Sunday visit, the day her parents looked away, Nathan arrived at Stamford County Court with his usual swagger. Hair gelled neatly, lapel pin gleaming. He winked at a local news reporter as he passed. Elena stood not far from the entrance, flanked by Laura and Sandra. Behind her sunglasses, her gaze was steady. Inside, Nathan's confidence began to splinter the moment Judge Michael Hartley stepped forward and solemnly announced his recusal. "Due to personal involvement, I will not preside over this case," he said. His voice was firm, controlled, but his shame hung heavy in the room. Nathan faltered. The new judge, a composed, no-nonsense woman in her 50s, called on Laura to present her case. Calmly, methodically, Laura laid out Elena's collected proof. Photographed bruises with timestamps. Voice recordings, Nathan's cruel words pouring through the courtroom speakers. Transcripts from workplace witnesses. Testimony from Sandra, describing how Nathan belittled both his wife and anyone he perceived beneath him. Elena sat motionless, steady. She didn't cry. She didn't flinch. She watched. Nathan's smirk disappeared. When Laura closed with, "This isn't just a story of a man's fall. It's a woman's rise. And no one should be asked to shrink so someone else can shine." The courtroom erupted in stillness and nods and hushed murmurs. The verdict? 5-year restraining order. Immediate dismissal from his firm. Financial penalties. Mandatory counseling. But what punished Nathan more than legal repercussions was what happened as he stepped outside. Reporters surged. Cameras flashed. Head lowered, bewildered and desperate, Nathan stumbled forward and sank to his knees on the courthouse steps. The smirk was gone. So was the illusion. Elena walked past him, chin lifted. No anger in her eyes, only clarity. "You hid behind perfection," she said softly. "Now the truth stands tall." And with that, she stepped into the waiting CRTG. Cold marble of the courthouse steps shimmered under the early afternoon sun. Reporters lined the perimeter, their murmuring hushed to a murky hum as Elena Hartley walked through the front doors, her lawyer Laura by her side. Inside, oak-paneled walls echoed with the distant fall of footsteps and paged documents. Each step Elena took felt weighted, but not with dread. There was resolve in her bones now, not fear. Nathan entered minutes later, wearing a tailored charcoal suit and an expression of forced calm. He scanned the pews confidently, half smiling as though attending a business review. But that arrogance faltered slightly when he saw the packed gallery, neighbors, journalists, and survivors who had recognized Elena's voice in the viral blog post and come to support her silently. Judge Michael Hartley's entrance brought the court to stillness. Elena held her breath. Her father's expression was unreadable as he examined the files before him. Then he spoke. "I must recuse myself from this case." Gasps rippled across the room. Nathan turned, confused. Elena remained still, eyes fixed ahead. "I refuse to participate in burying this," her father said quietly, before rising and leaving the bench. A new judge took his place, neutral but alert. The proceedings began swiftly. Laura presented Elena's evidence. Timestamp, MP'd photographs, voice recordings that caught Nathan's derision in icy detail, statements from Sandra and Alan. It was a latticework of truth, clear and damning. Nathan's own lawyer stammered through defenses, trying to spin control into concern. But the room had shifted. The truth was louder now. When Laura gave her closing remarks, her voice rang out, steady and clear. This case is not merely about bruises or one man's downfall. It is a mirror held up to the silence that allows harm to thrive. Elena did not just survive, she stood up, when even those closest to her refused to. Today is not the end of her story. It's the beginning of something just. When the ruling came, affirming the restraining order, affirming truth, the room exhaled. Outside, Nathan stumbled beneath the weight of what he'd lost. Cameras flashed as he dropped to his knees. Elena stood above him, poised. "I told you," she said softly, "you'd never break me." And then she turned, her path clear, her spine tall, as the world finally watched her walk free. Humid Connecticut air clung to Elena's skin as she stepped out of the courthouse, the marble steps beneath her heels echoing with each measured step. Her breath was steady, her spine upright, and in her hand was the envelope, the legal confirmation that her life was no longer tethered to a name that had once promised safety but delivered storms. Reporters crowded outside, cameras flashing like lightning strikes. Somewhere in the pushing crowd, someone shouted her name, her real one, not the alias she'd used on the blog. People knew now. And this time, knowledge wasn't power for the abuser. It belonged to her. Nathan stumbled as he emerged, flanked by his attorney. No one called his name. No well-wishers waited. Just flashes, murmurs, and judgment. His skin was pale against his navy suit, the sharp cut of his usual confidence dulled by the public spectacle. When he spotted Elena standing calmly just beyond the first row of onlookers, his steps quickened. "Elena," he said, his voice cracking. The crowd hushed. She didn't respond. She simply watched. He moved closer, shoulders sinking under the weight of everything he had lost in a matter of weeks: title, reputation, the illusion. When he reached her, his knees buckled. Literally. Nathan fell, not wounded by a blow, but by disbelief and desperation. He grasped at her wrist. "Please, we can fix this," he murmured, voice barely a whisper. Elena looked down at him, this man who had once controlled every room, every breath in their home. Now he looked small, undone. "No," she said simply. He blinked up at her, confusion clouding his eyes like fog on glass. "You don't have to ruin me." "I didn't," she said smoothly. "You did that yourself." Cameras clicked like thunderclaps. His grip fell away. She reached into her purse, pulled out her phone, and summoned an Uber. As it pulled up to the curb, she paused beside him one last time. "You underestimated me," she said. "You overestimated your silence." Then she stepped into the car, head high, the courthouse shrinking in the rear-view mirror as the city swallowed yesterday behind her, and carried her toward a different kind of life. Elena's new life smelled like rosemary and old wood. The Oregon air swept through the cracks in the window frames of her rented cottage, stirring her curtains and her soul. The old place creaked with a kind of honesty she hadn't known in years. No thin walls hiding raised voices, no hushed apologies from behind closed doors. Just her, the trees, the sound of rain tapping gently on the roof. A quieter world, but this time, the silence wasn't fear. It was peace. Her fingers moved with purpose now, cutting, soldering, polishing. The small sunlit table in her front room became her sanctum, littered with half-made rings and sketches in worn notebooks. At its center lay a design she kept returning to, delicate bands in silver or gold, with a tiny lightning bolt etched on the inside. Barely visible unless one looked, like power that didn't need to shout. She called them the Stormline Collection. Each piece she sent out felt like a quiet victory. Customers wrote from across the country, sharing stories of grief and bravery, of starting over. Some thanked her for the blog. Others didn't know the name Elena Hartley at all, only that the woman behind Silent No More created rings that felt like armor. She didn't need the world to know her anymore. She only needed to know herself. On Mondays, she volunteered at a local shelter, teaching creative workshops. On Sundays, she walked to the farmer's market, picking up lavender and bread, sometimes stopping to chat with a watercolor artist named Becca who didn't flinch when Elena touched her wrist. And in the drawer beside her bed, she kept a single ring for herself, the first she ever made, raw edges and all. Not a polished band, but unmistakably hers. She wore it only when she needed reminding. Not of what had broken her, but what hadn't. The fire she'd walked through. The voice she'd reclaimed. As she packaged another order, sealing it with a wax stamp, Elena looked out her window. Fog curled through the trees. She smiled, knowing deep down she owned something no one could take. Her name, her story, and a ring of her OWNTG letter arrived in a pale cream envelope, the kind her mother always favored, thick, elegant stationery with monogrammed letters and perfume lingering on the edges. Elena let it sit on the kitchen table for hours, unopened, while soft afternoon light slipped across her windowsill in Portland. Part of her had waited for this, confirmation that her parents had finally decided to acknowledge what happened. But even as she sliced the envelope open with a letter opener shaped like a swan, she already knew. She could predict every line before reading. They were sorry she felt the way she did. They regretted how things unfolded. They hoped, given time, she might concede, or coming home. Not once did their words include the truth. Not once did they write the word they needed to say, "We were wrong." Not once did they reflect on the day they saw her bruised face and chose silence. Elena folded the letter and put it back in the envelope. She didn't cry. She didn't rage. Everything that needed grieving had already wilted, buried in the Connecticut soil where her childhood once bloomed. Instead, she stood and walked out to the studio behind her cottage, a sunlit refuge filled with sterling charms, tiny hammers, spools of wire, and half-finished sketches. She walked to her desk and pulled out the identical stationery she'd bought months prior. She had prepared for this moment. Her pen inked the words slowly, carefully, without tremble. Mother. Father. You looked away. When I needed shelter, you offered civility. When I needed your voice, you gave me silence. I won't pretend those things didn't shape me. They did. Not in the way you preferred, but in a way that helped me see, clearly, finally. You don't get to rewrite the story now. I found peace on my own terms. I am no longer asking you to understand. That door is closed, and I'm not waiting on the steps anymore. Goodbye. Elena. She folded the note and sealed it inside. Tomorrow she'd send it, not for their benefit, but for her own. Another weight lifted. Another tie cut. And in that quiet, she smiled. Some farewells weren't sorrowful. They were freedom with wings to each storm past, but Elena remained. Stronger, forged in fire. The days after the court ruling moved like slow water. Quiet, reflective. Her bruises had faded, yes, but they remained in her memory, not as marks of weakness, but as proof of survival. Each morning, she ran her fingers over her cheekbone, not in mourning, but in reverence. Portland welcomed her with gentle rain and crisp air. The Pacific Northwest couldn't be more different from Connecticut's trimmed hedges and forced smiles. Here, nobody knew her history or her name. But when behind closed doors was mentioned in newsletters, in support circles, in online discussions, her message still lived, rippling outward like a stone tossed in a lake. In her small cottage tucked along a wooded road, Elena crafted. Not just items for her shop, but symbols. Each handcrafted ring bore a unique etch along the band, a lightning bolt, subtle and elegant. To the outside world, it was simply design. But for those who knew, who needed to know, it was a whisper of shared strength. Buyers began requesting pieces with custom messages, initials, affirmations, even court dates. Each package Elena mailed out carried more than silver, it carried a thread of solidarity. Her nonprofit, Silent No More, bloomed from the ashes. What began as a website with resources grew into an online platform, a digital sanctuary. Survivors submitted stories anonymously. Volunteers hosted virtual support groups. Social workers offered guidance. Elena never needed to show. Her face, it wasn't about fame. It was about reaching the hearts no one else had seen. Nathan, once the center of her world, vanished from her atmosphere. Stripped of his title and spotlight, he became a cautionary whisper in finance circles. Her parents, meanwhile, sat in their silence. The message Elena sent them, simple, unwavering, was never answered. But she didn't seek closure anymore. Some doors must stay closed. On a rainy afternoon, Elena stood by the window, warm mug in hand, gazing at the distant trees. Thunder rolled softly over the hills. She smiled, not because she had forgotten, but because she had risen. She had become the storm.